What if every choice you made was never really yours? In the Loop of Redwood Valley, Richard Mallory accepts what seems like a simple night shift at a quiet shopping mall. But behind the empty halls and flickering cameras hides something far darker, a repeating nightmare controlled by mysterious rules, unseen watchers, and a hungry entity feeding on fear itself. As Richard descends deeper into the endless cycle, he must uncover a horrifying truth. Escape isn't freedom, it's part of the game. And the loop always resets. The rain had been falling for hours when I finally pulled into the empty lot of Redwood Valley Mall. The wipers struggled to clear the sheets of water from my windshield, and for a moment, I sat there staring at the monolithic structure through the distorted blur, wondering why I'd even taken this job. I needed the money, that was a simple answer. After months of failed interviews and dead-send applications, Sentinel Entity Security had been the only company that called me back. $65 an hour for overnight security? Too good to be true, my parents had said. But too good to pass up, I had argued. The mall loomed before me, a concrete relic swallowed by trees and mist. Its towering facade bore no signs of life, no neon logos, no advertisements, just two glass entrance doors, framed by decaying pillars, as if the building itself had been waiting for someone stupid enough to walk in. I shut off the engine, adjusted my jacket, and stepped out into the cold. The rain slapped against my face like tiny needles. My breath fogged up instantly in the chilled air. A few other cars were scattered in the lot. I assumed the others had already gone inside. The company mentioned there would be a few other hires starting tonight, though oddly, there had been no mention of a supervisor or orientation. The front doors groaned as I pulled them open. Inside, the stale air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. The dim emergency lighting cast long shadows across the marble floors of the main atrium. I could hear my own footsteps echoing through the emptiness as I moved deeper inside. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the low hum of old ventilation fans. It was in the center of the lobby that I finally saw them, three men waiting under the weak glow of a flickering light. They turned as I approached. "Richard?" one of them asked. "Yeah," I replied, extending my hand. "Richard Mallory." The first guy shook my hand firmly. "Andy Torres. Nice to meet you, man." The second, a jittery younger man, offered a quick nod. "Marcus Whitaker." The third, standing slightly apart, barely mumbled, "Dylan," without making eye contact. Andy grinned, seemingly unfazed by the eerie atmosphere. "Looks like we're the new night shift. Weird nobody showed up to give us the usual run-through, huh?" "Yeah," Marcus said, his voice shaky. "Kind of unsettling. Guess we just start?" Andy shrugged. "The memo said to meet here at 10, so here we are." With no supervisor arriving and no instructions given, we agreed to split up and begin. Andy volunteered to cover the front entrance. Marcus and Dylan took opposite ends of the mall for initial patrols. I was left to handle the security office, my supposed safe zone. The office was tucked away behind an unmarked metal door on the second floor. I climbed the winding staircase that spiraled along the marble column in the center atrium, my footsteps echoing in rhythmic isolation. When I finally reached the room, it looked exactly how you'd expect an abandoned mall security office to look. Musty, outdated, slightly claustrophobic. 20 monitors flickered along the wall, each displaying different camera angles of the mall's many empty corridors and long-forgotten shops. I dropped my backpack beside the rusted chair and scanned the control panel. Most of it was simple. Rotate cameras, check logs, monitor sensors. The real surprise came when I opened the top drawer of the desk and discovered an old, tattered binder. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper that fell into my lap. The rules? Night shift security. The words were scrawled in jagged handwriting. Beneath it, a list of directives, half of which made no sense. Rule 1. Do not leave the security office unless it's your scheduled patrol time. Rule 2. If you hear or see anything strange, do not investigate. Rule 3. Patrol the mall once per hour, Each patrol must not exceed 15 minutes. Rule 4. If you're still outside after 15 minutes, hide immediately inside a store. Rule 5. If the phone rings, answer only if it's a coworker you recognize. Otherwise, hang up instantly. Rule 6. If knocking starts, hide in the restroom until it stops. Never open the door. Rule 7. If you hear crying or laughing during patrol, run back to the office immediately. Rule 8. If you see shadows on the monitors or in person, close your eyes and hide. If too late, lay down, count to 360, then open your eyes. Rule 9. If the alarm beeps, stare directly at camera 9 until the feed shuts off, no matter what you see. Rule 10. Redacted, page torn a page, half expecting it to be some elaborate joke. $65 an hour made a bit more sense now. But before I could toss the paper aside, the control panel let out a loud, piercing beep. The red indicator above camera 9 flashed. My throat dried instantly. The rule was clear. Stare at camera 9 no matter what. I hesitated for only a moment before my eyes snapped toward the monitor. And there it was. A thing. It stood hunched over Andy's limp, twitching body. The creature was impossibly tall and thin, its yellowed skin stretched like brittle paper over elongated limbs that ended in sharp needle-like points. One of its spindly appendages had already pierced through Andy's abdomen, lifting him effortlessly. Its maw, lined with too many teeth, unhinged wider as it pulled more of Andy inside, blood oozing along its chin and dripping onto the polished marble floor. Andy's eyes locked onto the camera, wide and pleading, until they rolled back, lifeless. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. My lungs burned as I involuntarily held my breath, frozen in terror. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the camera feed cut to black. The beep silenced. Only then did I collapse forward, retching violently into a nearby trash bin, stomach twisting in convulsions. The rules were not a joke, and tonight was only beginning. The retching wouldn't stop. My stomach emptied itself, but my body kept convulsing, dry heaves racking my chest as cold sweat dripped down my face. I gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles pale, breathing in short, shallow gasps. The fluorescent light above flickered, casting jittery shadows along the walls. The sour stench of vomit filled the cramped security office. Andy was dead, murdered by something, and I had watched all of it unfold, helpless, unable to do anything but obey the damn rule and stare into the monitor. The image of his wide, panicked eyes locked with mine haunted me. Even now, even as I squeezed my own shut and tried to erase the memory. But it wouldn't go away. My mind screamed at me to leave, run. But another part, the part that had read Rule 1 only minutes ago, whispered otherwise. Do not leave the office unless it's your scheduled patrol. I looked at the clock. Midnight. My first patrol was scheduled at 1 o'clock a.m. That left 1 full hour of sitting inside this tomb, knowing whatever that thing was still roamed the halls somewhere out there. A sharp, high-pitched ringing split the silence. The phone. My head jerked toward it. The old rotary phone sat on the desk, vibrating with the intensity of the ring. Rule 5 burned into my mind. Only answer if it's a coworker you recognize. Otherwise, hang up immediately. I hesitated, heart pounding in my throat. My hand hovered above the receiver. Then the tiny, muffled voice broke through the static speaker. Richard, pick up, it's Andy. I froze. My breath caught. Andy. But that was impossible. I had watched him die, had watched that monster shove him down its impossibly wide throat like a snake devouring prey. The voice continued, shaky, panicked, filled with dread. I saw something. Out in the parking lot. I don't know what it is. Please, check the cameras. It sounded exactly like him. The cadence, the way he stuttered slightly under stress. Just like when we'd first met. My fingers trembled above the receiver. Logic screamed at me that this was a trap. Whatever had killed Andy was now playing with me. But doubt crept in. What if somehow he had survived? Was it possible? Did I miss something on the camera? Maybe there was still a chance. Against everything screaming inside me, I picked up the receiver. "Andy, are you?" His voice cut in sharply, rushed. "Rich, listen to me carefully. You need to run. It's here. It's..." A horrible, guttural growl replaced his voice, followed by a wet, ripping sound like flesh tearing, and silence. The line went dead, the receiver slipped from my hand, swinging on its cord. My stomach turned again. Cold air poured down my spine. The clock ticked. 12:05 a.m. I was alone. Or at least, I hoped I was. I backed away from the desk, my eyes darting between the monitors, each camera cycling slowly through empty corridors and storefronts. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was now aware of me, closer than it had been before. My breathing turned shallow. My skin prickled as though invisible eyes watched from every corner of the room. The low knock startled me so violently I almost screamed. 3 knocks. Steady. Deliberate. They came from the security office door behind me. I stumbled backward into the desk. My heart thundered in my ears. Another knock. Louder. "Richard," came a voice. Familiar. Too familiar. "It's me, Marcus. Let me in, man." Marcus. I hadn't seen him since we'd split up earlier, but doubt gripped my chest like a vice. I hadn't seen Marcus on any of the monitors either. The rules. The goddamn rules. If knocking starts, hide in the restroom until it stops. Never open the door, I bolted. The restroom was adjacent to the office, through a short hallway no longer than 10 feet, but those 10 feet felt like a mile. The knocks grew more violent behind me. The voice calling out turned frantic. "Richard, please, you have to open up. It's out here." I slammed the bathroom door shut and locked it, collapsing onto the cold tile floor, panting, every inch of my body shaking. The banging intensified, the door frame rattling under the force. The voice outside shifted from desperate pleading to something unnatural, raspy, guttural, almost gurgling. "Open the door." I pressed my hands over my ears. My teeth chattered. Tears blurred my vision. The door creaked under the strain, hinges groaning, but it held. Then, silence. The banging ceased. I waited. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. The silence weighed heavier than the knocking had. Finally, I dared to move, crawling toward the door, listening carefully for any hint of movement outside. Nothing. I waited longer than I probably needed to before slowly unlocking the door and inching it open. The hallway was empty, but the office lights now flickered erratically. The monitors glitched, static crackling through half the screens. I glanced at the clock. 12:59 a.m. Patrol time. Every cell in my body screamed at me to stay put. But the rules were clear, and after what I'd just seen, I wasn't ready to break them. Shakily, I strapped on my flashlight and opened the office door, stepping into the long, silent hallway. The mall stretched before me like a corpse. Dead stores, mannequins frozen behind dusty glass, neon signs flickering in half-life. The rules said 15 minutes, no more. I walked fast. Shadows danced along the edges of my vision. Every creak and groan of the building sounded like whispers trailing just behind me. As I neared one of the empty storefronts, something clattered inside. A shelf falling? Or perhaps a mannequin tipping over. I froze. My breath fogged up in front of me. A soft laugh, high-pitched and breathy, echoed from the darkness ahead. I spun and ran. The office door came into view like a beacon in the void. I stumbled inside and slammed it shut, locking every bolt. My chest heaved. My vision swam. My hands trembled so violently I could barely hold myself upright. And then came the beep. That same sharp, high-pitched tone. Camera 9 was flashing again. I didn't want to look, but I did. On the screen, Marcus stood alone in the lower atrium, trembling, staring into the dark. Behind him, something moved. something tall. Its long, spindly fingers reached for him. The camera feed cut to black. I collapsed to the floor as the room spun around me. I was in hell. And it was only my first night. The buzzing fluorescent lights hummed above me as I lay sprawled on the cold, grimy tile floor of the security office. My vision pulsed at the edges, black spots dancing like ink blots under my eyelids. I had lost track of how long I sat there, frozen. Time inside this place was beginning to blur. The clock said 2:07 a.m., but it might as well have been noon or midnight. The mall was silent again. Silent, except for my heartbeat hammering in my chest. I kept seeing it, Marcus on camera 9, standing helpless while that thing reached for him. That sickening, slow extension of elongated limbs closing in, like something out of a nightmare designed to break your sanity. I had tried to tell myself that maybe it was another trick, that maybe Marcus was still alive somewhere in the mall. But I knew better. I had seen Andy die, and now Marcus. I was next. The security manual lay open on the desk where I left it, its pages gently fluttering from the occasional gust of air venting through the cracked ceiling tiles. The rules were still there, staring back at me, cold and indifferent. Rule 6. The knocking. My ears twitched at the thought of it. I didn't want to hear it again, but almost like the mall itself was reading my mind, it came. Knock. 3 sharp, steady raps against the office door. Not loud, not violent, almost polite. I froze in place. Knock. I felt bile rise into my throat. Richard, came the voice. Richard, please. It's me. It was Marcus. His voice was calm now, softer than earlier. Too soft, too even. I need your help, man. I'm stuck. Open up, please. The words dug under my skin. Marcus was dead. I had seen it happen. Whatever was out there was no longer trying to hide that it could copy them. The knocking grew more rhythmic, the intervals perfectly timed, almost mechanical. My legs trembled as I slowly pushed myself upright, backing away from the door. My breath came in shallow, sharp gasps. I stumbled toward the bathroom again. The door to the restroom was already open this time, as though inviting me inside. I stepped through and quietly locked it behind me, pressing my back against the cold wall, hands clenching tightly into fists. The knocking didn't stop, but the voice changed. It wasn't Marcus anymore. It was my brother. Rich. The word was drawn out, elongated unnaturally. Rich, it's me, remember? You promised you'd protect me. I clenched my jaw, refusing to respond, but my mind slipped. For a split second, I was a kid again, standing in my parents' hallway, watching my brother's lifeless body being wheeled out by paramedics. His wide, empty eyes staring upward, mouth slightly open, as if trying to call for me one last time. You let me die, the voice whispered now, directly behind the door. My vision blurred as tears welled up, threatening to spill over. No, I whispered to myself. It's not real. This isn't real. The thing outside dragged its nails across the metal surface, creating a shrieking metallic scrape that drilled into my skull. You owe me. The knocking stopped. Silence returned once again, heavy, suffocating. I stayed pressed against the wall, my entire body locked in place for what felt like hours before I finally heard the faintest click. The sound of something gently tapping the outer door handle of the security office again. But this time, there was no voice, only breathing. Slow, heavy, animalistic. I waited until it was gone. When I finally emerged from the restroom, my legs barely carried me forward. The office was untouched, at least visually, but I knew something had changed. The monitors flickered again, static slicing through some of the feeds, but one camera, camera 12, briefly stabilized. For the first time tonight, something appeared that sent a new kind of dread coursing through me. A figure stood at the far end of the West Wing corridor, staring directly into the camera, not moving, not blinking, But it wasn't any of my coworkers. It was me, my own face, my own build, wearing the same uniform, even the same ID badge. The doppelganger remained perfectly still, except for a faint smile that stretched unnaturally wide across its face, as though someone had sliced the corners of its mouth. I staggered back, slamming my fist against the desk, causing the monitors to briefly lose signal before returning to static. This was something new. It wasn't trying to just kill me, it was trying to replace me. Or worse, maybe it already had, and I was simply the shadow now. I rubbed my face, trying to steady my breathing, my heart thumping painfully in my chest. 3:02 a.m. The clock kicked down toward my next patrol at 3 o'clock sharp. I didn't want to go out there, but Rule 3 was clear. Patrol once per hour, no more than 15 minutes. Stay out longer and you'll need to hide. The hallway beyond the security office door stared back at me like the maw of some enormous creature, dark and gaping. The distant emergency lights barely illuminated the wide-open space. As I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but abandoned storefronts and silent mannequins. 15 minutes. That was all I needed. The West Wing corridor, the same hallway where my double had appeared, waited ahead. I didn't want to go there. But something told me that if I didn't face it, it would find me regardless. The West Wing stretched out in front of me like a hollow throat. The silence out here felt heavier than in the security office, as if the mall itself was holding its breath. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud against the smooth tile floor as I moved deeper into the corridor. My flashlight beam danced across long, dead storefronts. The mannequins inside were frozen in outdated seasonal displays. Winter jackets, scarves, fake snow. Some had lost arms, others toppled sideways. Their empty faces stared back at me, catching the beam for brief moments that made my pulse spike. My reflection occasionally flickered in the glass, reminding me of what I had seen on camera 12, my own face. But not mine. I tried not to think about it. I had exactly 15 minutes, no more. The rules had made that clear, and yet every fiber of my being screamed that 15 minutes was too long. A distant metallic clatter broke the silence. My head whipped toward the sound, and my flashlight beam caught movement near one of the old toy stores. My shelving unit had collapsed inside, plastic boxes and toys scattered across the floor. I froze, holding my breath. Something was in there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it watching me from the darkness beyond the glass. A soft, wet dragging sound followed, like something sliding across tile. Then silence again. I took a cautious step back, never taking my eyes off the storefront. Don't investigate. Don't break the rule. Keep moving. I swallowed the rising panic and forced my legs to keep walking, flashlight bouncing with every shaky step. The further down the West Wing I went, the colder it seemed to grow. My breath became visible again in the beam, curling up like smoke. The old atrium ahead loomed in shadows, where the glass ceiling stretched into the dark sky above. Moonlight barely peeked through cracks in the filthy panes. And then I saw it, standing directly under the broken skylight. Me. Or at least, the version of me that should not exist. It stood still, face tilted slightly upward, as if admiring the rotten ceiling. The doppelganger wore the same black jacket, the same badge, but its face was off, too smooth, skin too tight, as though stretched thin over the skull. And that smile, that wide, impossibly white smile. The eyes were worse, milky white, pupilless voids that shimmered faintly under the moonlight. It didn't move, but I could feel it was aware of me. My chest seized with fear so intense I nearly dropped the flashlight. I should have turned back. I should have run. Instead, I stood frozen, hypnotized by the silent figure. That's when it finally moved. Its head jerked violently toward me, snapping its neck at an unnatural angle with a sharp crack that echoed through the atrium. The smile widened even further. Then it began to walk, slow, deliberate steps. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. flashlight beam spinning wildly across the ceiling. 15 minutes. Stay under 15 minutes. I yanked my watch into view. 12 minutes in. I still had time. I turned and sprinted. The hallway blurred around me as my breathing grew ragged. My pounding footsteps drowned out every other sound except for the soft, methodical tapping of its footsteps following behind. Tap, tap, tap. Not running, pacing itself, toying with me. The office door came into sight at the far end of the corridor, barely illuminated under the flickering emergency light. Almost there. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it closing in. The air behind me grew colder, denser, as though the mall itself was folding inward with every step I took. I threw myself against the office door, fumbling the keys with trembling fingers before finally wrenching it open and slamming it shut behind me. The deadbolt clicked. The locks slid into place. I collapsed to the floor, panting, my ears ringing. Then came the knock. 3 soft, deliberate knocks against the door. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my back against the cold metal, trying to drown out the sound. Knock, knock, knock. The voice returned. But this time, it was my own voice. Richard? Open up. Perfectly mimicked. The same tone, same inflection. You're safe now. It's over. My breathing grew shallow, my vision blurred. You made it. Let me in. The door handle jiggled slightly. I shook my head, teeth clenched, refusing to respond. The voice shifted again, this time blending into something lower, inhuman. You're already one of us. A dry, rattling laugh followed, a sound that didn't belong in any world I understood. Then silence. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Finally, the monitors flickered back to life, most feeds coated in static. But camera 9 stabilized again. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were drawn to it like a moth to flame. There, standing where Marcus had once stood, was my double again. This time closer to the camera. Its eyes locked directly into mine, and slowly, without breaking eye contact, it raised one hand and waved at me. Not mockingly, but as if greeting an old friend. The feed cut to black. I collapsed forward, clutching my head in my hands. I couldn't take much more. The rules had kept me alive, for now. But they weren't protecting me. They were preparing me. And the knocking never stopped. I woke up in the security office. Again. The first thing that hit me was the fluorescent flicker overhead. That same dim buzz. The same monitors lined along the wall. The same faint chemical odor lingering in the stale air. It was as if nothing had happened. No knocking, no voices, no doppelganger. The office was exactly how it had been when I first walked in. Immaculate, untouched, my stomach twisted. I sat up slowly, my limbs stiff and sore, like I'd been lying there for hours. The clock on the wall blinked at me with its steady digital glow, 10:03 p.m. It made no sense. I hadn't slept. I knew I hadn't. My memory was crystal clear. I remembered Andy's death. I remembered Marcus. I remembered the knocks, the voices, the thing that wore my face. And yet here I was, back at square one, as though none of it ever happened. The weight of it made me feel sick. I forced myself upright, steadying my legs beneath me, and stumbled over to the desk. The old security binder sat neatly closed where I'd first found it. Hands trembling, I opened it. The same list of rules stared back at me. All of them, intact, untouched, except for Rule 10. That page remained torn out, like it had never been discovered at all. The office phone sat quietly on its cradle, no longer scorched from the grotesque hand that had once emerged from it. Even the trash bin where I'd thrown up earlier was empty and clean. My head spun. Had I imagined it, hallucinated everything? But that couldn't be right. The fear in my chest was real. The screams, the blood, the cold metal of the door against my back as the knocking shook it violently. I wasn't losing my mind. something else was happening. A loop. The realization crashed down on me like a tidal wave. I wasn't trapped in this place. I was trapped in time. The mole was forcing me to repeat the night, over and over again. But why? The shrill beep of the control panel snapped me from my spiral of thought. Camera 9 flashing, my stomach lurched. My hand instinctively hovered near the screen. Obey the rule. I turned toward camera 9, forcing myself to watch. The screen flickered, but this time nothing horrifying appeared. No creature, no murder, just static. The camera stabilized for a brief moment, showing the empty atrium, still and lifeless beneath the skylight. Then it went dark again. For some reason, that emptiness was more terrifying than the horrors I had seen before. It was adapting, changing the game. My eyes shifted toward the far corner of the office, where a stack of files caught my attention. They hadn't been there before. A manila folder labeled in bold black marker, Personnel Records, Redwood Valley Mall. My pulse quickened. I reached for the folder, flipping through its contents. Inside were employee files, mostly generic, janitors, cashiers, former managers, but one name made my blood run cold. Mallory. Richard. It was my file. Photo ID stapled to the top corner, dated 13 years ago. I stared at the picture. It was me. Same face, same build, same name. But I looked younger, maybe 15 years old. The file listed my position as security trainee, the date of hire, October 15th, 13 years prior. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers trembled as I flipped to the next page. A hospital document from the State Mental Health Record Center. Patient Richard Mallory. Diagnosis: dissociative amnesia. Notes: survivor of Redwood Valley incident. Memory suppression authorized. The words blurred on the page as my vision swam. I staggered back, nearly dropping the file. This wasn't the first time I had worked this job. I had been here before. I had survived once already, but had been made to forget. And now, they'd sent me back. A soft click echoed behind me. The office door. I turned sharply, but it remained closed. Instead, the knocking returned, not violent this time, gentle, rhythmic. Richard, the voice called, but not in any voice I recognized. It was a new voice, female, calm. "You're doing well," it whispered. "Better than last time." My heart pounded. The air grew colder, and I saw my breath fog in the stagnant air. "You're learning. That's good. That's why we brought you back." I said nothing. "You broke before. We had to reset you." My skin crawled as I backed toward the monitors. "This place needs you. You're special, Richard." The voice smiled through its words. I could hear it. And then, silence. The monitors flickered again. Camera 12 stabilized. There I was again, my double, standing in the West Wing hallway, facing the camera. But this time, something new hung around its neck. A lanyard. An ID badge. The same ID badge as in my personnel file. Dated 13 years ago. The doppelganger raised its hand and pointed directly at the lens. Directly at me. The feed cut to black. I gripped the edge of the desk, my breath short and rapid. This was far worse than I had imagined. The loop hadn't just started. It had never ended. I stood in front of the monitors, barely breathing, feeling the weight of every second pressing down on me. The voice outside the door had stopped. The knocking had stopped, but the silence wasn't comforting. It felt loaded, heavy with things unseen, waiting. My mind spun, trying to make sense of what I'd just discovered. I wasn't new to this job. I was never new. 13 years ago, I had already faced this place and somehow survived. But someone, or something, had wiped it from my memory, forcing me back into the same nightmare, like a lab rat returning to the maze. The file didn't say why. It didn't say who authorized it. But it didn't have to. This place was never abandoned. It was curated. The beep of the console pulled me back, slicing through my spiraling thoughts like a razor. Camera 9 flashing. I closed my eyes for half a second, trying to steady myself. Obey the rules. Always obey the rules. I turned to the monitor, locking my eyes onto camera 9. The image snapped into focus. It wasn't Marcus this time. It wasn't Andy. It was me. The other version of me stood in the atrium, bathed in pale light from the broken skylight above. It wasn't moving, just standing there, head slightly tilted as if studying the camera, studying me. Then slowly it raised one hand and pressed its finger to its lips. Shh, the image glitched, pixels tearing at the edges of the screen, then stabilized again. But something had changed. Behind the doppelganger, stretching out like long black tendrils from the shadows, were the shapes of other figures, dozens of them. Limbs too long, necks craned unnaturally, and their eyes, empty, hollow sockets, stared straight into the lens, straight into me. My stomach flipped. The air in the office grew thinner, like something massive was pressing down from above. Then the screen cut to black. I stumbled back, crashing into the desk behind me. They were gathering, and they were waiting for me. The clock blinked again. 2:59 a.m. Another patrol was due. The rules hadn't changed. 15 minutes, no more. I didn't know if I could take another round, but staying put wasn't an option either. The rules weren't made to protect me. They were made to contain me. Or worse, to train me. The door creaked as I opened it, flashlight in hand, stepping once more into the empty hallway. This time, the air felt wrong from the start. Colder, tighter, like walking inside a lung that refused to breathe. My footsteps echoed differently. The walls of the mall seemed to stretch and contract subtly as I moved, as if pulsing. The West Wing loomed ahead. My eyes instinctively avoided the atrium, where the skylight hovered above like a cracked eye staring down. I wanted to avoid that place entirely, but the path curved me back toward it, whether I wanted to or not, and there it stood again, the other me. Only now, it wasn't standing still. It paced slowly across the open marble floor, circling like a predator. Its smile never left its face. Its head snapped toward me as I approached, neck twisting too far to be human. I froze, my flashlight beam shaking violently across the floor. The doppelganger stopped pacing, locking its dead white eyes onto mine. "You're almost ready, Richard," it said softly, though its lips never moved. The words weren't spoken aloud. They vibrated inside my head like a needle digging into my brain. "I was weak once too," it continued, "but they fixed me." I stumbled back. The tendrils behind it slithered forward, reaching toward the floor, coiling like snakes. "You don't have to fight it. Let it in." I turned, running before I even realized I was moving. The world behind me warped, walls elongating, lights flickering as if reality itself was breaking down under my feet. My watch vibrated wildly on my wrist. 14 minutes. I was running out of time. The office was within sight again, but my legs burned, chest heaving as the cold seemed to weigh down on my shoulders. I threw myself through the office door, locking it behind me with trembling hands. For a moment I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air. The monitors glitched, flickering uncontrollably as static filled my ears. Then, amidst the chaos, one feed stabilized unexpectedly. Not camera 9 this time, camera 5, the entrance. The feed showed 3 new individuals walking into the mall lobby. New recruits, judging by their fresh security uniforms. I recognized their faces. One looked just like Marcus, another resembled Andy. The third had Dylan's same withdrawn posture. But these weren't the same men I had met before. These were new, or replacements. The realization crashed into me like a cold wave. The loop wasn't just for me. The system was resetting entirely, over and over again. And I was just one piece of it. The console beeped again, a new message flashing across the screen in red text. Recalibration complete. Phase 2 initiated. I stared, my breath shallow, as the door behind me clicked. The locks slowly began to slide open, on their own. The knocking didn't come this time. Only the quiet, familiar voice returned, slipping through the small crack in the door. "Welcome back, Richard." The door creaked open on its own. I couldn't move. My back was pressed so hard against the far wall of the security office that my spine ached. The air in the room grew colder, denser, like something massive had silently stepped inside. But nothing appeared. Not yet. The voice returned, softer than before. Smooth, familiar. "You've come so far, Richard." I sounded like my own voice again, only cleaner, more polished. Like a version of me without hesitation or fear. "You've seen enough now. You're ready." My breath came in short, shallow gasps. My mind screamed to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I could only sit there, staring at the door, inching wider, its shadow slicing across the floor like a blade. The monitors behind me flickered rapidly, glitching between feeds I didn't recognize. Not just the empty halls or atrium anymore, but glimpses of other rooms. Rooms that didn't exist in this mall. Concrete chambers, bright surgical lights overhead, empty beds with restraints. For a brief second, one monitor froze on a single frame, a patient strapped to a table. It was me, a younger me, eyes wide and blank, mouth agape as doctors hovered over my restrained body. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. The voice laughed gently, as though amused by my revulsion. "You're remembering." I shook my head. No, I'm not supposed to." "But you are, because we want you to." The voice carried no malice, no threat. It was calm, clinical. The door fully open now, revealing nothing but the empty hallway beyond. Except, it wasn't empty. There was a new object sitting on the ground just outside the threshold, a small, worn metal lighter. Scratched, dented, familiar. I recognized it instantly. My brother's lighter. I don't know how it ended up here, or if it ever truly left, but seeing it ripped something open inside me. I stumbled forward, legs weak beneath me, and snatched the lighter from the floor. My hands trembled as I held it, flicking the spark wheel almost instinctively. The flame danced in the stale air, and as the heat licked my fingers, my eyes dropped to the tattered binders still open on the desk. The rules. My heart pounded harder. Rule 10 had been ripped out. But what if it hadn't been removed entirely? Almost in a trance, I flipped the binder over and held the flame close to the back side of the last page. At first, nothing. Then, slowly, faint words began to appear, surfacing like invisible ink under heat. Rule 10. Emergency. Survival. If subject experiences destabilization after awakening, proceed to rooftop. Full reset via controlled leap. Highest probability of containment restoration during final operational hour. As I read the words again and again, my brain struggling to process them. It wasn't a survival rule. It was a failsafe, a last resort. If I couldn't handle the loop, I was to throw myself from the roof before contamination spread any further. The knocking, the voices, the doppelgangers, the tests. It was all part of some containment system, and I was part of it. "You see now," the voice cooed from behind me. I turned sharply. There was nothing there, just the cold, the dark. My own reflection stared back at me from the blackened monitor screens. "But you still have time," it whispered. "The roof waits." I staggered backward, my breathing uneven, thoughts racing. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an experiment, one I had been a part of before, and one I was being forced into again. How many times had I reset? How many times had I jumped? The thought made my stomach churn. The monitors glitched again. New recruits. 3 faces flickered across the screen. Fresh hires walking confidently through the lobby. Different people, but the pattern was always the same. I was never alone. I was always part of the system, and if I failed now, I would return here again, wearing the same uniform, forgetting once more. The idea of leaping off the roof didn't terrify me as much as it should have. In some strange way, it felt familiar, almost comforting. I clenched the lighter tightly in my palm, the heat of the flames still flickering. The roof. That was my way out. The clock blinked. 3:15 a.m. 45 minutes until the end of my shift. 45 minutes to decide if I would finally break free or fall back into the loop. Either way, I wasn't waiting any longer. I grabbed my flashlight, shoved the binder aside, and pushed the office door fully open. The hallway stretched ahead, long, empty, suffocating. But I knew my destination now. The stairwell to the rooftop sat at the far end of the east wing. I started walking, and behind me, somewhere in the unnatural hush of the mall, the voice followed softly, whispering like a lullaby. "Good, very good, Richard. This time, maybe you'll finally make it." The stairwell was colder than the rest of the mall. The air grew thinner with each step, my breath forming pale clouds in front of me, swirling like fading ghosts. The narrow concrete walls closed in around me, pressing against my shoulders. The fluorescent bulbs overhead flickered weakly, buzzing like dying insects, barely pushing back the shadows that crept up the stairwell like vines. I could hear my heart beat louder than my own footsteps. Floor after floor, step after step, my legs trembled beneath me, not entirely from exhaustion, but from something else, something far worse. Anticipation. The rooftop wasn't far now. The lighter felt warm in my pocket, a small pulse of reality grounding me as my mind threatened to fracture again. I reached the final landing and froze. The heavy steel door to the rooftop stood before me. Unlike everything else in the mall, this door looked new, polished, clean. As if whoever maintained this twisted loop made sure this exit always stayed functional. Painted in white block letters across its surface, "Authorized personnel only." I laughed bitterly under my breath, as if any of this was ever authorized. The handle was cold as I pushed it open. The wind hit me instantly. The rooftop stretched out before me like an endless sheet of black glass. The faint glow of the town beyond flickered distantly under the stars, but it was swallowed by the heavy cloud cover above. Moonlight slipped occasionally through the cracks, casting long skeletal shadows across the rooftop's surface. There was no safety rail here, no warning signs, just open space. It wasn't designed for survival, it was designed for falling. The rules had been clear. Proceed to rooftop, full reset via controlled leap. I stood near the edge, toes hanging just inches from oblivion. The cold wind whipped against my face, slicing through my uniform, pulling at my body as though encouraging me forward. Far below, I could just barely make out the tops of trees that lined the back perimeter of the mall. A soft crunch of gravel behind me made my blood freeze. I turned sharply, flashlight beam slicing through the dark, and there it was, my other self, standing no more than 10 feet behind me. The doppelganger smiled that same unnatural grin, its milky eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. The skin around its face was tighter now, almost as if the mask it wore was beginning to crack from the strain. "You made it," it whispered. The voice echoed like multiple people speaking in perfect unison. My mouth went dry. "Why?" Its head tilted sharply, bones popping unnaturally as it moved. "Because you are necessary." The wind howled around us, carrying its words as if they belonged to the air itself. "You've always been necessary, Richard. Your fear feeds the cycle. Your choices keep the balance." I shook my head. "I'm not part of this." "You are this," it corrected softly, taking a slow step forward. Its movement was smooth, unnatural, as though gravity had only partial control over it. "I survived once," I hissed. "I broke free." Its smile widened, splitting the corners of its lips unnaturally far. "No, you never left." The realization struck me like a hammer. The reset wasn't because I survived. It was because I failed. Each time I reached this rooftop, each time I jumped, the loop simply restarted. my memories wiped, my terror recycled, my compliance recalibrated. I wasn't surviving, I was submitting. The doppelganger took another step, its voice lowering into something almost tender. Don't fight anymore. Let it happen. I stumbled backward toward the edge, my heel hanging over empty space. My heart raced. It reached out a hand. One more time, Richard. One more reset. One more perfect cycle. I stared at the outstretched hand, my mind spiraling through flashes of everything I'd endured. The deaths of Andy and Marcus, the knocking, the voices, the screams that belonged to no one. And finally, my own face staring back through glitching cameras. I clenched my fists, feeling the lighter press into my palm. For a moment, I nearly stepped forward. Nearly. But then I heard another voice. Faint. Fragile. My brother's voice. You promised you'd protect me. Tears burned behind my eyes as the memory resurfaced. Not the twisted imitation that mocked me before, but the real one. The night I lost him. The night I failed him. And somehow I understood. I couldn't submit again, not this time. I flicked the lighter open, flame dancing defiantly against the cold wind. The doppelganger flinched, its grin flickering for the first time, as if the fire disturbed something within it. Its voice wavered, becoming more distorted. Don't do this. But I was already moving. I turned, facing the void behind me. The blackness below seemed to pulse and breathe, waiting eagerly. I whispered, almost to myself, no more resets. And then, I jumped. The air rushed past me like a scream. The wind tore at my body, spinning me in freefall as the mall shrank above, becoming just a distant wound in the night sky. For the briefest moment, I thought I heard the voice shriek in frustration above me, and then, everything went black. The first thing I felt was pressure. Not pain. Not yet. Just pressure. Heavy. All-consuming. Then came the sharp, searing agony as my body screamed life. The world around me slowly formed in pieces. Blinding white light above, the sterile scent of disinfectant, the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. My vision blurred, unfocused, swimming in and out of clarity like waves breaking against a shore. I was alive. Somehow, the fall should have killed me. I turned my head slightly, wincing at the stiff pull in my neck, and saw the familiar sanitized walls of a hospital room. Machines beeped in synchronized rhythm to my heartbeat. Thick casts wrapped around both my legs and left arm. My ribs ached with every breath. Muted voices murmured outside the door. I was breathing. I was awake. But I wasn't free. The door opened, and a man in a white coat entered, his face carefully composed with a smile just polite enough to seem human. The hospital badge clipped to his chest read, Dr. Samuels. Good, he said softly, approaching my bedside. You're awake sooner than we anticipated, Mr. Mallory. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like sandpaper. The doctor poured water into a cup and held the straw to my lips. I drank greedily, the cool liquid slicing down my dry throat. He continued once I'd finished. You've suffered multiple fractures, legs, wrist, ribs, minor concussion, but considering the circumstances, I didn't respond. I didn't need him to explain what circumstances meant. I remembered everything. The mall, the rules, the voices, the loop, the rooftop, the jump. He studied my silence before speaking again. The police report will state that you fell or jumped from the roof during the evacuation when the fire broke out at Redwood Valley Mall. He paused, watching my reaction carefully. That's the official version. I stared back at him, my face void of emotion. But I assume you remember more than that, he added, voice dropping slightly, as if testing my stability. I stayed quiet. Because I understood the game now. They wanted me to speak, to confess what I knew, to gauge how much of their experiment had leaked through the amnesia. I know about Sentinel entity security, I finally rasped. For a brief second his smile faltered, but only just. You're confused, he replied calmly. There is no such organization, just a simple contract security firm you signed on with. An unfortunate accident. Trauma can create false memories. I almost laughed. Gaslighting wrapped in professional detachment. But behind his polished performance, I saw it. The glimmer of control, the quiet panic behind his eyes. They hadn't expected me to remember this much. I looked away, toward the muted TV mounted on the wall. News footage played silently. Images of the mall engulfed in smoke. Emergency responders swarming the site. Redwood Valley Mall, fire under investigation. Casualties avoided as night shift escapes blaze. The captions lied as effortlessly as the man beside me. They'd rewritten the narrative already. He followed my gaze and sighed, as if fatigued by my stubbornness. "There will be compensation," he said, returning to his script. "A settlement check will be issued. The company has agreed to cover your medical expenses, of course." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it gently on the small table beside my bed. Painful knowledge, a $10,000 0 cents, and full medical coverage until you're back on your feet. The bribe was insulting. I turned back to him, my voice sharper now despite the pain. "And then what? Another contract? Another assignment?" His face never broke composure. "That won't be necessary. You've done your part." "Done my part?" I almost spat the words back at him. "Done my part for what? For whom?" Sentinel Entity Security wasn't just a rogue company. They were orchestrating something far more sinister. A contained experiment, feeding off terror, memory suppression, and behavioral conditioning. I wasn't their employee. I was their subject. As if reading my thoughts, Dr. Samuels glanced at the heart monitor, then leaned closer. "You should rest, Richard," he said softly. "The more you dwell on these delusions, the harder your recovery will be." Delusions. They always defaulted to that word. I said nothing. There was no point, not yet. He straightened, smoothed his coat, and headed for the door. Before leaving, he paused. "We'll speak again soon." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone in the cold glow of the monitors. My eyes drifted back to the envelope on the table. I already knew what was inside. Not just money, a contract. A continuation of the loop, disguised as reward. And then I noticed something else tucked just beneath the envelope. A card. Plain, unmarked. Except for 3 words printed in bold, black letters. "We are watching." My blood ran cold. I clenched my fist, feeling the dull ache shoot through my fractured arm. My breathing slowed. They hadn't let me out. They were simply repositioning me. Preparing me? The loop was never about survival. It was about compliance, and I was still inside it. The card sat on the table like a silent threat. "We are watching." Not "get well soon." Not "congratulations on surviving." Just a blunt, suffocating reminder of who was still pulling the strings. Even here, especially here. They wanted me to know this wasn't freedom. This was controlled observation. I stared at the ceiling for hours after Dr. Samuels left. The beeping of the monitors blended into a dull hum as my mind spun in tight, suffocating circles. They weren't done with me. I'd jumped. I'd followed Rule 10 to the letter, but they never intended for that to be the end. Rule 10 wasn't designed for escape. It was part of the loop's architecture, just another layer of containment, another test of compliance. And I had complied. Again. The door opened softly sometime after midnight. I didn't have to look. I already recognized the pattern. The soft footfall, the careful rehearsed movements. Another handler. This one was different. A woman in a dark gray business suit. Her hair was tied back tightly. Her expression neutral but efficient. No coat, no badge. She didn't belong to the hospital. She belonged to them. "Mr. Mallory," she greeted, voice smooth, polished like glass. "You're recovering well. That's good." I didn't respond. She stepped closer, resting a slim black tablet at the foot of my bed. "I represent Sentinel Entity Security directly," she said. No more pretense. No more hiding behind vague hospital bureaucracy. I finally turned my head to meet her gaze. Her eyes were unsettlingly calm. "I know who you are." Her thin smile never touched her eyes. "Of course you do. You've always known. But you're remembering more now. That's progress." The word made my stomach turn. I forced my voice out, throat still raw. "How many times?" Her head tilted slightly, amused by the question. "More than once. Fewer than forever." She let the ambiguity hang there, like a hook sinking deeper into my chest. "You reset the loop every time I reached the rooftop." She nodded gently, as though praising a child for connecting dots. Rule 10 functions as a self-correcting mechanism. The moment full destabilization occurs, panic, rebellion, awareness, we initiate controlled reset protocols. You chose compliance. That's the critical factor we track. I clenched my jaw, feeling heat rise behind my eyes. And the others? Andy, Marcus, Dylan. Were they real? Her expression didn't falter, but something flickered behind her eyes, a brief glimmer of discomfort. "Templates," she said flatly. "Behavioral scaffolds. Some were real once, most are modeled." I felt my stomach twist. "You murdered them." She didn't flinch. "Their participation allowed for valuable data refinement. Each iteration brings us closer to full synthesis." I laughed bitterly, the sound raw in my dry throat. "Synthesis of what?" Her answer was immediate. "Containment stability." The room felt colder. "You're not studying me," I whispered. "You're feeding something." Her silence was confirmation enough. Whatever entity haunted that mall, those shadows, those voices, the doppelganger, it wasn't fully theirs. They weren't controlling it. They were negotiating with it. The loop wasn't containment. It was appeasement. She moved to the tablet, unlocking it with a swipe of her thumb. "Your recovery is nearly complete, Mr. Mallory. Your psychological resilience has exceeded our prior thresholds. We believe you're ready for integration into the next phase." I glared at her. "You mean another loop?" "Permanent placement," she clarified. "Supervisory capacity, field control. You won't be subjected to resets anymore." My blood ran cold. "You want me to help run the system?" "Correct. You've adapted better than any prior candidates. You've learned to obey the rules instinctively. You've faced destabilization events repeatedly and recovered. You are uniquely qualified." My pulse thundered in my ears. "You think I'll agree?" She smiled thinly. "You already have." With one motion, she slid the tablet toward me. The screen displayed the digital contract. My name was already filled in at the top. Richard Mallory, Field Coordinator, Sentinel Security. Security box waited at the bottom, pulsing gently. "Sign voluntarily," she said. "Or we initiate reset protocols, again." The weight of the word crushed me. Again. Start over? Forget again? Watch Andy and Marcus die again? Wake up in that office again? Obey those rules again? The loop would never stop unless I broke it. But they had engineered it so meticulously that every path led back to this moment, to choice disguised as inevitability. I stared at the tablet, breathing hard, my mind screaming against itself. Submit or restart. Obey or erase. My hand hovered above the screen. The woman's voice softened. "This is mercy, Richard. This is peace. No more falling, no more fear." I closed my eyes, and I understood the cruel brilliance of their design. They didn't want compliance through force. They wanted me to surrender willingly, to become part of it by my own hand. I exhaled slowly, opening my eyes again. For the first time, my voice was steady. "I want to see the rooftop." Her expression shifted, only slightly, but the flicker of unease was there. I smiled coldly. "If I'm going to sign," I continued, "I want to stand there one more time." A pause. She studied me, calculating. uncertain whether this was manipulation or genuine acceptance. Finally, she nodded once. "Very well." She turned toward the door, speaking softly into a hidden ear. "Prepare him for transport." The black SUV sliced through the foggy night like a silent predator. I sat in the back seat, strapped in, my broken bones braced tightly within thick medical wraps. Two men sat in front, both dressed in black, silent, robotic. No names, no conversation, just careful, practiced efficiency. The woman sat beside me, tablet still in her hands, reviewing data like nothing happening tonight was remotely unusual. Outside, the forest thickened, tree trunks flashing by under the high beams like pillars in some ancient temple. The world grew emptier the deeper we drove, as though we were moving off the map entirely. And then, through the mist, I saw it again. The mall. Redwood Valley Mall. It looked no different than before. The towering monolithic structure loomed beneath a cloud-choked sky, its empty parking lot lit by harsh floodlights mounted on distant poles. The same broken glass doors, the same crumbling exterior, as if the fire they reported had never happened, or had simply been part of the performance. The vehicle slowed and came to a stop at the main entrance. The guards stepped out wordlessly. One of them opened my door. The woman turned to me, her expression neutral. "You'll find this easier if you accept your role, Richard." I didn't answer. My legs burned with every step as they guided me through the entrance, but I forced them forward, leaning heavily on the cane they'd provided. The pain anchored me, kept my mind clear. The atrium stretched open like a dead cathedral, marble floors shining beneath flickering lights. Every corner of the mall looked untouched, reset once again. No scorch marks, no collapsed ceilings. The loop had cleansed the scene perfectly. As we walked, I noticed subtle changes I hadn't seen before. Small details. Symbols etched into the support columns. Strange geometric sigils partially hidden beneath layers of new paint. Faint humming emanating from the walls themselves, barely audible, like the pulse of a machine breathing beneath the surface. We didn't stop at the office this time. The woman led me directly to the central stairwell, the same one I had climbed before. The rooftop waited. At the base of the stairs, she finally paused and faced me. "This is your decision point, Richard. There is no reset this time. You either integrate or..." Her voice trailed off, leaving the unsaid threat hanging like a noose between us. I stared up the stairwell. The air grew colder with each breath I took, my skin crawling, and I saw it. The faintest silhouette waiting at the top, watching. My double. Still there, still waiting. "I climb alone," I said. She hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed her face again. "You have 5 minutes," she said finally, signaling the guards to stay behind. I gripped the handrail and pulled myself upward. The climb was slower this time, the weight of my body nearly unbearable. My heart pounded with each step, my cane clacking against the concrete. As I reached the final landing, the door was already ajar. The wind howled through the opening like a voice, whispering ancient truths. I stepped through. The rooftop spread out beneath the churning clouds, the sky alive with writhing shapes that didn't belong in any earthly storm. The swirling void above pulsed like a wounded heart. And there, standing near the edge as always, was myself. The doppelganger turned slowly, its grin stretching wide as it opened its arms. "Welcome back," it rasped, voice fractured, vibrating with unnatural resonance. I limped forward, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't, not anymore. "You've made your choice," it said. I nodded. "I have." Its head cocked sharply. "Integration ensures peace." I took another step closer. "Peace for who?" I whispered. "For me or for you?" It didn't answer. The wind howled louder and the sky above twisted unnaturally. "You feed off the loop," I continued. "The fear, the submission, the repetition. Every reset, every fall. It was never about containing you. It was about feeding you." The doppelganger twitched. Its smile faltered for the first time, warping slightly as thin cracks split across its face like porcelain fracturing under heat. "You're learning too much," it hissed, voice doubling over itself into static. I pulled the lighter from my pocket, the same battered lighter I'd carried through every iteration. The flame roared to life, steady despite the wind. "The loop ends tonight." The doppelganger recoiled, the cracks across its face spreading further as its hands clenched unnaturally at its sides. The swirling sky above pulsed wildly now, as though the entire system sensed the disruption. "You can't sever it," it shrieked. "You are part of it." I stepped closer, voice calm. "Then I'll take us both out of it." And I knew in that moment exactly where I needed to go. Not the edge, not the fall. Something deeper, something beneath all this. The seal, the true source. I turned my gaze downward toward the service hatch near the base of the rooftop's antenna. The hidden access I hadn't noticed before, concealed behind machinery during every prior loop. The hatch leading into the heart of the system, the real, final layer. The doppelganger's scream distorted as its body convulsed violently, its human form melting like wax under a heat lamp. "You're not allowed," it roared. "You are not authorized to breach the seal." I gritted my teeth, voice steady. "I don't need authorization." As I moved toward the hatch, the storm above fractured entirely, splitting into violent spirals of black void, and somewhere deep beneath my feet, something ancient stirred. The final seal was waiting, and I was finally ready to face it. The hatch groaned under my grip as I wrenched it open. The wind howled behind me, the doppelganger's distorted screech rising with the storm as it contorted, its human shape breaking down entirely into something formless, shivering like black tar struggling to hold structure. I didn't look back. Below the hatch, a rusted maintenance ladder disappeared into darkness. A pulse emanated from the open shaft, low and deep, vibrating in my chest like a second heartbeat. Whatever lay beneath the mall, beneath the loop, beneath everything, I was going to meet it now. I climbed down, rung by rung, as the world above dissolved into chaos. The descent seemed endless. The metal groaned beneath my weight. Damp air thick with the smell of iron and rot. Somewhere far above, the sounds of the rooftop battle dimmed into a distant echo. The walls around me pulsed faintly, as if the concrete itself was breathing. Finally, my feet hit solid ground. I found myself in a narrow tunnel. Crude carvings covered the walls, symbols older than language, spiraling patterns like nests of coiled serpents. Fluorescent tubes flickered sporadically overhead, but most had already burned out, leaving much of the corridor in shadows. The air grew colder as I limped forward, cane tapping against the uneven floor. My breath fogged in front of me. And then I reached it. The chamber. The true heart of Redwood Valley. The room wasn't large, but its ceiling stretched far above into darkness. In the center, embedded into the ground like some ancient lid, was a massive circular seal. Metallic, engraved with those same writhing sigils. The edges of the seal pulsed faintly with a sickly orange glow, as if something beneath it was still alive, waiting. Around the perimeter stood 6 massive monoliths, each identical in shape but etched with unique symbols. Thick black cables ran from each monolith into the center of the seal, humming softly with unnatural energy. At the far side of the room stood a console, modern, out of place. Its screen displayed rows of code scrolling endlessly, alongside a single line blinking in harsh red text. Containment loop. Active subject stability. Compromised manual. Locked. I understood now. This wasn't containment. This was incubation. They hadn't been studying me. They'd been using me, using all of us, to sustain whatever was trapped beneath that seal. Every fear, every death, every loop fed into this system like blood into an ancient altar. I was never the prisoner. I was the offering, and I was about to end it. My hand hovered over the console, sweat pooling along my brow despite the cold. The interface was locked. Of course it was. But I didn't come this far for permission. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out the lighter once again. The flame flared to life, steady and strong, dancing like a beacon in this suffocating tomb. I lowered the flame to the exposed wiring beneath the console. The plastic coating hissed instantly, melting into noxious smoke as sparks danced upward. The system sputtered. Sparks flew as the cables ignited, followed by a loud pop that echoed through the chamber. The monoliths shuddered, their humming intensifying into panic static. The orange light beneath the seal began to pulse erratically, as though the creature trapped below sensed the breach. And then the alarms began. Shrill metallic screams reverberated through the tunnel, accompanied by flashing red lights that painted the chamber like a warning beacon. Containment failure. Emergency protocol engaged. The very ground beneath my feet trembled. The creature stirred. A fissure split across the seal's surface, thin cracks bleeding faint beams of blinding orange light upward. From behind me, I heard the rush of boots, the agents, the handlers, the corporations scrambling to stop me. Their voices echoed through the tunnels like insects swarming. "Shut it down," one of them shouted. "He's breached primary containment." More footsteps, more shouting. They had sent everyone. I stumbled backward toward the center of the chamber, the heat radiating from the cracked seal intensifying as the fissures widened. "You've doomed us!" one of the handlers screamed from the entry tunnel. "No," I rasped, barely hearing my own voice over the rising cacophony. "You did that the moment you started this." The seal split wider with a deafening crack. And from the widening gap, an unnatural gust of air surged upward, cold yet burning, carrying with it whispers in languages I couldn't understand. Voices layered over one another like 1,000 mouths speaking at once. The monoliths collapsed one by one, toppling like felled trees under an invisible force. Sparks rained down like fireworks. The agents were screaming now, running for the stairwell, but it was too late. The chamber was coming apart. I felt my body lifted slightly off the ground, drawn toward the opening fissure, as gravity twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. The weight of it pulled at my bones, but I clenched my fists, holding my ground, refusing to be dragged into whatever waited below. Above me, through the cracks in the ceiling, the storm outside finally broke open entirely, splitting the night sky like torn fabric. And beyond it, for the first time, I saw it. The thing. Not a form, not a creature, an absence, a shape of nothingness, darker than the void, pulsing with hunger. The true entity they had bargained with, the one behind every loop, every reset, every manipulation. And it was finally free. The seal exploded outward with a force that slammed me against the far wall. My vision blurred as stone and fire erupted through the chamber. The screams of the handlers were consumed instantly, their bodies torn apart by waves of force I couldn't see, only feel. The last thing I saw before everything was swallowed in white was my own reflection briefly mirrored in the shattered remains of the console, still breathing, still alive, and then nothing. I don't know how much time passed after that. I woke up somewhere new, a hospital, but not like the one before, smaller, less clinical, more contained. The windows were sealed, the doors locked from the outside. My hands were restrained but loosely. A soft voice hummed nearby. "You're awake, Mr. Mallory." I turned my head slowly. Dr. Samuels. Still here, still watching. But now... The smile was different, less certain. "You've broken protocol," he said quietly, "and yet you survived. The entity is unstable now. The loop is damaged." His voice lowered, almost reverent. "But it's not over, Richard." I smiled faintly, the weight of exhaustion pulling at my eyelids. "Good," I whispered, "because neither am I." And that was the Loop of Redwood Valley. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've survived the full descent into Richard's twisted reality. Or maybe you're still inside it. Huge thanks to every single one of you who stayed with this story till the end. Your support, your theories, your comments, they're what keep this channel breathing. If you enjoyed this horrifying journey through loops, rules, and dark experiments, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. so you won't miss the next nightmare we dive into. And hey, remember, not every door is meant to be opened. Until next time, sleep well, or try to.